A millionaire took his receptionist to a gala dinner, and her attitude surprised everyone. Alexander Mitchell's cell phone vibrated incessantly on his mahogany desk on the 47th floor of the Mitchell Tower in Seattle. 15 missed calls from his press officer in the last 2 hours. He knew exactly why. The photos of his ex-fiancée, Victoria Kensington, kissing the yoga instructor had just been leaked to the local press. "Mr. Mitchell?" Charlotte Hayes' soft voice sounded through the intercom. "Miss Palmer is insisting on speaking to you. She says it's about tonight's charity dinner." Alexander ran a hand through his meticulously trimmed brown hair, looking out of the panoramic window at the city that stretched out at his feet. The Mitchell Foundation for the Arts benefit dinner was the most important event of the year for his family, and now he was without a chaperone. "Charlotte, could you come in for a moment, please?" The door opened quietly, and Charlotte Hayes entered the room with her usual discretion. Her red hair was tied up in a professional bun, and her green eyes, partially hidden by delicate framed glasses, avoided direct contact. "How long have you worked for me, Charlotte?" 2 years and 4 months, sir," she replied, nervously adjusting the briefcase she held against her chest. Alexander stood up, walking over to the window. "And in all that time, have you ever seen me ask for anything personal?" "No, sir." "Well, today will be the first time." He turned to face her. "I need an escort for tonight's charity dinner. Someone discreet, professional, and who won't add fuel to the tabloids." Charlotte blinked several times, processing the request. "Sir, do you want me to find someone?" "No, Charlotte. I want you to accompany me." The silence that followed was interrupted only by the distant sound of traffic 47 floors below. Charlotte clutched her briefcase tighter. "Mr. Mitchell, I don't have anything appropriate to wear to an event like this." Alexander was already reaching for his phone. "Sandra," he said as he made the call, "I need you to take Miss Hayes to Nordstrom now. Pick out something suitable for dinner tonight. My card is with you." Before Charlotte could protest, the well-oiled machine that was Alexander Mitchell's life was already in motion. Within minutes, Sandra, his personal assistant, arrived to take Charlotte shopping. What Alexander didn't know was that, while his receptionist was being taken to choose a gala dress, a Steinway piano was waiting in the lounge of the Four Seasons, where the dinner was to be held. The same model that Charlotte had last played 8 years ago, before her younger sister's illness had forced an impossible choice between music and family. Hours later, Charlotte was unrecognizable in an emerald green dress that highlighted her eyes. Her hair, now loose in soft waves, framed a face that professional makeup had subtly transformed. "You look different," was all Alexander could say when he saw her in the lobby of the building. In the car, on the way to the hotel, Charlotte kept her hands folded in her lap, trying to control the trembling in them. It wasn't just the nervousness of being next to her boss in such a different context. It was the closeness to a world she had left behind. "There's something you should know," Charlotte began, her voice almost a whisper, "about why I chose to work as a receptionist." But Alexander was engrossed in his phone, answering yet another series of messages about the scandal with Victoria. Charlotte swallowed his words, along with her memories of the Manhattan Conservatory of Music. The Four Seasons was magnificently decorated for the event. Crystals reflected the golden light, creating an atmosphere of timeless elegance. Charlotte felt her heart race at the sight of the piano on stage, an old friend she had abandoned so long ago. During dinner, conversation flowed around her like a distant symphony. Executives, artists, and socialites were discussing the Mitchell Foundation's latest acquisitions for the new cultural center that would open next month. "And do you, Miss Hayes, enjoy classical music?" asked an elderly woman sitting opposite her. "Actually," Charlotte began, but was interrupted by a growing buzz. The pianist who was due to perform had been in a car accident on the way to the event. Alexander looked tense. The musical performance was the highlight of the evening, when donors usually made their biggest commitments. Charlotte looked at the piano, then at her hands, the same hands that had played in Carnegie Hall when she was 19. 8 years had passed, but some things the body doesn't forget. "I can play," she said, so quietly that only Alexander heard. "You what?" "I can play," she repeated more firmly, getting up before her courage evaporated. As she walked towards the piano, Charlotte felt the weight of every gaze on her. But as she sat on the bench, as she touched the keys for the first time, something changed. The outside world disappeared, and there was just her and the music. Her fingers began to dance over the keys, and the first notes of Clair de Lune filled the room. The music flowed through her as if the last 8 years had never existed. When the last note faded into the air, the silence that followed was absolute. Alexander Mitchell stood, his eyes fixed on Charlotte as if seeing her for the first time. And in a way, he was seeing her for the first time not as his discreet receptionist, but as someone with depths he had never imagined. The applause that followed was deafening, but Charlotte barely registered it. Her eyes met Alexander's across the hall, and in that moment, something changed irrevocably between them. The music had revealed truths that words could not express, and now there was no turning back. The reflection of the piano still shone in the tears in Charlotte's eyes when she finally left the makeshift stage. The applause continued, but she barely registered it, concentrating only on getting back to her seat without tripping over her emerald dress. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Alexander asked when she sat down, his voice softer than Charlotte had ever heard it. Before she could answer, they were interrupted by an elegant lady who approached the table. "Madame Rousseau?" Charlotte whispered, immediately recognizing her old mentor from the Manhattan Conservatory. "Ma chérie," the Frenchwoman smiled, her gray eyes sparkling with recognition. 8 years, and you still play like an angel. Why did you abandon everything?" Alexander watched the interaction with growing interest, while Charlotte felt the weight of her past collapsing on her shoulders, carefully uncovered by the gala dress. "I had family responsibilities," Charlotte replied, her hands intertwining nervously over the silk napkin. "Responsibilities?" Madame Rousseau arched a perfectly drawn eyebrow. "You were about to go on your European tour? You'd just been awarded the Juilliard Prize." Charlotte's face turned red, and Alexander realized that his discreet receptionist held many more secrets than he could have imagined. The conversation was interrupted by a group of patrons of the arts approaching, all eager to meet the mystery pianist of the evening. "If you'll excuse me," Charlotte muttered, standing up abruptly. She needed air, space, distance from the memories the performance had unearthed. Alexander found her minutes later in the hotel garden, sitting on a stone bench, watching the reflection of the moon in the ornamental fountain. Her black blazer covered her shoulders, a gesture he didn't even remember making. "You must be wondering why your receptionist never mentioned that you were an award-winning pianist," she said without looking at him. "Actually, I'm wondering why someone with your talent chose to work as a receptionist." Alexander sat down next to her, keeping a respectful distance. Charlotte took a deep breath, the Seattle night air carrying the scent of gardenias from the garden. "My sister, Sophie, was diagnosed with a rare form of leukemia when I was 19. I was about to embark on my first international tour." His voice faltered for a moment. "The doctors said she would need a bone marrow transplant. I was the only match." "And you chose your sister," Alexander added softly. "It wasn't really a choice," Charlotte smiled sadly. "Sophie was 15. Our parents died in an accident when we were little, and we were brought up by our grandmother. When she died, we only had each other." Alexander observed Charlotte's delicate profile against the soft light of the garden. How had he never noticed the depth in her green eyes, the strength hidden behind that fragile appearance? "The procedure was a success," she continued, "but the recovery was long. Sophie needed constant care, and the medical bills." Charlotte shrugged. "I sold my piano first. Then I took the most stable job I could find." "And your sister?" "She's in her second year of college now. Medicine." The pride in his voice was palpable. "She wants to help other people like her." A moment of silence fell between them, filled only by the soft sound of the water in the fountain. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Alexander finally asked. "And what would I say? 'Good morning, Mr. Mitchell. Would you like some coffee? By the way, I used to play at Carnegie Hall.'" Charlotte laughed, but the sound carried a note of bitterness. "Do you still play?" "Today was the first time in 8 years," she admitted. "Sometimes, when I pass a music store, I stop to look at the pianos. But," she hesitated, "some doors are difficult to reopen." Alexander stood up abruptly, holding out his hand to her. "Come with me." "Where to?" "Trust me." 20 minutes later, they were back in the lounge, now practically empty. The hotel staff had already started clearing the tables, but the Steinway piano remained untouched on the stage, as if waiting for them. "Mr. Mitchell, I can't." "Alexander," he corrected her softly. "And yes, you can. In fact," he smiled, "as your boss, I'm ordering you." Charlotte felt an involuntary smile form on her lips as she took to the stage again. This time, when her fingers touched the keys, there was no audience, no pressure, just music. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the empty hall. Alexander watched, mesmerized, as Charlotte lost herself in the music. Her eyes closed, her body moving gently with the melody. When the last note faded into the air, Charlotte opened her eyes to find Alexander closer than she expected, his intense gaze fixed on her. "I think I've just had an idea," he said, a smile forming on his face. "The foundation is in need of a director for the new music education program, Alexander. I can't accept. I'm not offering charity, Charlotte. I'm offering an opportunity for you and dozens of children who could benefit from your talent and experience." The silence that followed was filled with unspoken possibilities, with doors that were beginning to reopen, with dreams that perhaps weren't so lost after all. "Can I think about it?" she finally asked. "Of course," Alexander replied, offering his arm to help her down from the stage. "In the meantime, how about having dinner with me tomorrow? To discuss the details of the show, of course." Charlotte accepted his arm, sensing that something fundamental had changed between them. Music had broken down barriers they didn't even know existed, revealing truths they were both still beginning to understand. Charlotte stared at her reflection in the mirror of the Mitchell Tower ladies' room, trying to recognize herself in the woman who had played the piano the night before. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the collar of her white blouse, a tremor that didn't exist when her fingers touched the keys of the Steinway. "Charlotte?" The voice of Sandra, Alexander's personal assistant, sounded from the other side of the door. "Mr. Mitchell asked you to come to his office as soon as possible." Charlotte's heart raced. After dinner the night before, Alexander had left her at home with the promise of talking about the music education program. Now, in the light of day, it all seemed like a distant dream. Entering Alexander's office, Charlotte found him on a video conference. He gestured for her to wait, his eyes lingering on her a moment longer before returning their attention to the screen. "No, Richard, I will not reconsider," Alexander spoke firmly. "The music education program will be implemented." In fact, he cast a meaningful glance at Charlotte. "I've just found the perfect person to run it." Charlotte felt her cheeks burn. Through the window, Seattle stretched out under a surprisingly blue sky, as if the city had also been transformed by the music of the night before. "Charlotte," Alexander finally ended the call. "Sit down, please. We have a lot to discuss." "About last night," she began, but Alexander gently interrupted her. "First of all, I need to apologize," he said, surprising her. "I've spent 2 years seeing you every day without actually seeing you. What kind of person does that make me? The busy type running a business empire?" Charlotte tried to joke, but her voice shook slightly. "The blind type," he corrected, getting up to lean on the edge of his desk, closer to her. "But now that I know who you really are, I can't ignore your talent. The foundation needs someone like you." Charlotte took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "Alexander, I appreciate the offer, but before you refuse," he interrupted her again, "I'd like you to know something." Minutes later, they were in the elevator going down to the basement of the building. The doors opened onto a space Charlotte had never seen before, a fully equipped music studio. "What's that?" "Part of the new cultural center," Alexander explained, leading her through the space. "But we still haven't managed to find the right person to bring it to life." The studio was impressive, with several classrooms, a small auditorium and, in the center, a Yamaha grand piano that made Charlotte's heart soar. "How many talented children are there out there, Charlotte? How many have the gift you have, but don't have the means to develop it?" His words hit a tender spot in her heart. Charlotte approached the piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. Sophie always says I've wasted my talent looking after her, Charlotte confessed softly. But I've never felt that way. Some choices aren't really choices at all. Alexander approached, his discreet perfume mingling with the smell of new wood from the studio. What about now? What choice would you make now? Charlotte closed her eyes, letting the memories flow. The long hours of practice, the thrill of the performances, the gleam in her old teacher's eyes when she mastered a particularly difficult piece. May I? She asked, indicating the piano. Alexander nodded, watching as she sat down at the instrument. This time, when her fingers touched the keys, it wasn't a classical piece that emerged, but a composition of her own that she had kept in her heart for 8 years, a melody that spoke of loss, love, and new beginnings. Did you compose that? Alexander asked as the last note faded into the air. Charlotte nodded. When Sophie was in hospital, it helped pass the time between chemotherapy sessions. Charlotte, Alexander sat down next to her on the piano bench, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his body. You don't have to choose this time. You can have both your music and your current life. It's not that simple. Why not? He turned to face her. The program needs a director who understands not just music, but overcoming difficult choices, starting over. Charlotte felt something change in the air between them. The closeness, the intensity of Alexander's gaze, the music still echoing in the space, all conspired to create a moment of crystal clarity. What about dinner tonight? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. Is it also about the show? Alexander smiled. A different smile than she had ever seen before, softer, truer. No, he admitted. The dinner is about finding out who Charlotte Hayes is beyond the music, beyond the receptionist, beyond the devoted sister. Alexander's phone vibrated, breaking the moment. He checked it quickly, frowning. Emergency meeting with the board in 10 minutes. Charlotte stood up, adjusting her pencil skirt. Shall I prepare the meeting room? No. Alexander stood up too. Today you have the day off to think about my proposal. Both proposals, actually. He hesitated for a moment before adding, I'll pick you up at 8? Charlotte nodded, a shy smile playing on her lips. As she watched him go, her fingers unconsciously played the piano keys, producing soft notes that seemed to dance in the air. For the first time in 8 years, she allowed herself to dream of possibilities that went beyond duty and responsibility. The sound of the piano followed her to the elevator, like a promise that some melodies never really end. They just wait for the right moment to begin again. The Gala's restaurant, with its panoramic view of Lake Union, seemed to vibrate with a different energy that evening. Charlotte nervously adjusted the navy blue dress she had bought during her lunch break, more modest than the emerald of the night before, but still elegant. Miss Hayes, the maitre d', led her to a discreet table by the window, where Alexander was already waiting for her. He stood up when he saw her, his gaze roaming briefly over her figure before settling on her face. You look beautiful, he said simply, pulling out a chair for her. Thank you. Charlotte hesitated, looking out at the illuminated city beyond the glass. I've been thinking about your proposal all day. Which one? Alexander smiled, making her blush. Before she could answer, they were interrupted by the sommelier. Alexander chose a red wine, consulting Charlotte with a glance before confirming the selection. You know, he began after the sommelier had left, I've been researching you all morning. Charlotte felt her stomach knot up. Did you find much? Enough to make me wonder how I let so much time pass without realizing who you really are. Alexander leaned forward slightly. Winner of the Van Cliburn International Piano Competition at 18. Full scholarship student at Juilliard. Critics predicted you'd be the next Martha Argerich. That was in another life, Charlotte replied softly, her fingers playing with the linen napkin. Was it? Alexander questioned. Because the woman I saw playing last night didn't look like someone who had left music behind. She looked like someone who carries the music with her every breath. The wine arrived, offering Charlotte a moment to reorganize her thoughts. After the first sip, she found the courage to face him. This afternoon, I called Sophie, she revealed. I told her about the music education program. She cried. Charlotte smiled at the memory. She said it was time I stopped using her as an excuse not to live my dreams. Your sister sounds wise. She is, but she's also stubborn and determined. Family traits, apparently. Dinner came in a sequence of elaborate dishes that on any other night would have impressed Charlotte. But at that moment, her attention was entirely focused on the conversation, on the way Alexander watched her, as if trying to decipher a particularly intriguing riddle. Why me? She finally asked. There must be dozens of qualified musicians interested in the position. Because you understand that music isn't just about technique or talent, Alexander replied without hesitation. It's about choices, sacrifices, starting over. It's about turning pain into beauty. Charlotte felt something flutter in her chest. How can you be so sure about me after just 2 days? Maybe I was paying more attention than you realize, even before. Alexander paused, taking a sip of wine. Do you think I haven't noticed how you calm angry customers by humming tunes while you serve them? Or how your fingers drum on the reception desk following musical patterns? I do that, Charlotte asked, genuinely surprised. All the time. It's as if the music leaks out of you, even when you try to contain it. Dinner progressed between conversations about music, memories, and long-held dreams. Charlotte surprised herself by sharing stories about her years at the conservatory, about nights rehearsing until her fingers hurt, about the first time she played for an audience. There was a piano in my grandmother's house, she said, dessert already served in front of them. An old out-of-tune Yamaha. She used to say that I started playing before I learned to speak properly. And now? Alexander asked softly. Are you ready to speak through music again? Charlotte took a deep breath, looking down at her hands that had been busy with paperwork and phone calls for so long, but had never forgotten the feel of the keys under her fingers. Yes, she finally answered, but I have a few conditions. Name them. I want to continue working part-time on reception, at least initially. I need to make sure I can make it work before I take the plunge. Alexander nodded. Reasonable. What else? I want the program to be accessible to everyone. No exclusive focus on prodigies or children from wealthy families. That was already in the plans, he smiled. In fact, I was thinking of setting up a scholarship system. Charlotte hesitated, gathering her courage. I want it to be separate from work. If it doesn't work out, Charlotte, Alexander interrupted her gently, reaching for her hand on the table. Nothing that happens between us will affect your position in the program or the company. You earned it on your own merit. The touch of their hands sent an electric current through Charlotte's arm. It was different from the day before, more intimate, more deliberate. There's a place I want to show you, Alexander said, asking for the bill. If you trust me one more time. 20 minutes later, they were walking up to the penthouse of the Mitchell Tower. The space, which Charlotte had never visited before, was a hanging garden overlooking the whole of Seattle. Not many people know, but this was my mother's favorite place, Alexander revealed, guiding her through the plants. She was also a musician, a classical pianist. Was? Cancer, 5 years ago. He stopped near the edge, where a small pavilion housed something covered in a cloth. This was her piano. Charlotte watched in silence as Alexander removed the cover, revealing a beautiful Bosendorfer grand piano. No one has touched it since she left, he said softly. Maybe it's time to change that. Under the Seattle stars, with the city shining at her feet, Charlotte sat down at the piano. Her hands found the keys naturally, and the first notes of River Flows in You filled the night. Alexander watched her, realizing that perhaps he too was ready for some new beginnings. The next morning, Mitchell Tower looked different to Charlotte. The same glass and steel walls now reflected not only the light of the rising sun, but also the possibilities unfolding in front of them. Sitting at her desk in reception, her fingers typed with a new purpose. They were no longer just computer keys, but notes of a symphony in the making. Good morning, Charlotte, Sanders' voice interrupted her thoughts. Mr. Mitchell asked you to come up to the meeting room on the 45th floor at 9 a.m. Something about presenting your vision for the music education program to the board. The initial panic Charlotte felt was quickly replaced by a familiar determination she felt before big presentations. Opening her handbag, she took out a small worn notebook where, During the early hours of the morning, she had scribbled down ideas for the program while the memory of the night before still echoed in her mind. The elevator rose smoothly, and Charlotte took advantage of those moments to organize her thoughts. The doors opened to reveal a silent corridor, but as she approached the meeting room, heated voices reached her ears. "Alexander, be reasonable," a male voice argued. "We can't entrust a project of this size to a receptionist, no matter how well she plays the piano." "Richard," Alexander's voice sounded controlled, but Charlotte could detect the underlying tension. "You've heard her play. You saw how she won over the whole room in a matter of minutes. One performance doesn't make her qualified to manage $1 million program." Charlotte took a deep breath, adjusted her navy blazer, and entered the room. 6 pairs of eyes turned to her, including Alexander's, which shone with something close to pride. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice firm, "will you allow me to share my vision for the program?" Without waiting for an answer, Charlotte walked to the front of the room. Years of public performances had taught her that hesitation was a luxury musicians couldn't afford. "When I was 12, she began, "I won my first piano competition, not because of my exceptional talent, but because I was the only participant in my social category who had access to an instrument to practice on." She paused strategically. "Imagine how many talents we lose every day because children don't have access to musical education." For 40 minutes, Charlotte presented her detailed plan. She talked about partnerships with public schools, a mentoring system with retired musicians, instrument loan programs. Each aspect carefully considered, each number meticulously calculated. But the most important thing, she concluded, is not to train virtuosos. It's giving every child the chance to discover music as a universal language, as a tool for expression and transformation. The silence that followed was broken by Richard, the same man who had questioned her competence. "What about your administrative experience?" 2 years and 4 months managing reception at Mitchell Tower have taught me more about management than my conservatoire did about music," Charlotte replied with a slight smile. "Here, I learned how to balance multiple demands, manage crises, and, above all, turn limited resources into exceptional results." Alexander watched the scene with a mixture of admiration and something deeper that he wasn't yet ready to name. This wasn't the shy Charlotte from the reception, but neither was she the dazzling pianist from the night before. She was a unique fusion of both, secure in her competence and passionate about her vision. After the meeting, as the board members left muttering in more positive tones than when they arrived, Alexander found her organizing her notes. "Impressive," he commented, moving closer. "Where was this Charlotte all this time?" "Always here," she replied, meeting his gaze. "Just waiting for the right song to dance to." A moment of understanding passed between them, full of unspoken possibilities. It was interrupted by Charlotte's cell phone, a message from Sophie. "My sister," she explained, smiling as she read it. "She wants to know if I've sorted out my love life along with my professional one." Alexander laughed, a rich sound that made something flutter in Charlotte's chest. "Have you? Some symphonies need time to fully develop," she replied, surprising herself with her boldness. "In that case," Alexander leaned closer, his voice dropping to a more intimate tone, "how about we start with lunch? I know a place near the new cultural center. We can discuss the next steps in the program." "Just the program?" Charlotte asked, arching an eyebrow. "For now," he smiled, offering his arm. "After all, as you said, some symphonies need time." As they walked to the elevator, Charlotte realized that her life had turned into something that not even her wildest dreams could have predicted. Like a complex composition, every note, every pause, every moment of silence had its purpose. And now, finally, she was ready to play her own melody. A week after her presentation to the council, Charlotte found herself in her new office at the Cultural Center, still trying to process the speed with which her life had changed. The walls, freshly painted in a soft shade of blue, displayed framed posters of great composers, a personal touch that Alexander had insisted she add. "First lesson in 15 minutes, Sandra announced, entering with a stack of sheet music. "The parents of the children in the pilot program are already arriving." Charlotte nodded, nervously adjusting her glasses as she reviewed her notes. The program would begin with 10 students selected from local public schools, children who, like herself years ago, showed musical talent but lacked the resources to develop it. "Oh, and Mr. Mitchell asked me to confirm dinner tonight," Sandra added with a suggestive smile. "Sandra," Charlotte began, but was interrupted by the sound of small footsteps in the corridor. The first student to arrive was Maya Thompson, a 9-year-old girl with elaborate braids and curious. When the last student left, Charlotte allowed herself a quiet moment at the piano, her fingers gliding gently over the keys. "Impressive," Alexander's voice surprised her from the doorway, especially little Maya. "How long have you been there?" "Long enough to see that I wasn't wrong about you." He entered the room, carrying a briefcase under his arm. "I've brought something that might interest you." Inside the folder were old newspaper clippings, reviews of his performances, photos of competitions. "How, Sophie," he explained, taking a seat next to her on the piano bench. She kept everything in storage, waiting for the right moment to give it back. Charlotte gently touched a photo where she was smiling at 17, holding a trophy. "It seems like another life." "It is," Alexander agreed. "But perhaps this new life you're building can incorporate elements of the old one, not as a repetition, but as an evolution." Their gazes met, and Charlotte felt that familiar electric current between them. Over the last few days, between planning meetings and dinners that extended far beyond professional discussions, something was growing as delicate as a pianissimo note. "I have a presentation next month," Alexander commented casually, "to raise funds for the program. I was thinking—" "No," Charlotte interrupted, understanding immediately. "It's too early." "It's the perfect time," he insisted gently. "The program needs visibility, and you need to stop hiding." "I'm not hiding," she protested weakly. "I'm rebuilding." "Then let me help with that rebuilding." Alexander took her hands, and Charlotte noticed how they fit perfectly in his. A duet, you and me. The proposal hung between them, loaded with meaning beyond music. Charlotte thought of Maya, of how the girl had looked at the piano with the same longing she herself had felt for so long. "On one condition," she finally replied. "I want Maya to open the event. She has a natural gift for Chopin." Alexander's smile lit up his face. "Always negotiating, Miss Hayes?" "I learned from the best, Mr. Mitchell." He leaned in slightly, and for a moment Charlotte thought he was going to kiss her. Instead, his fingers found the piano keys, starting the first bars of Heart and Soul. "Really?" Charlotte laughed. "Of all the songs? Sometimes we need to start with the basics," he winked, continuing the simple melody. "Besides, it takes two to play." Charlotte gave in, joining him in the familiar melody. Their fingers danced together over the keys, creating a harmony that went beyond the notes. "About dinner tonight," she began, without stopping playing. "Yes? Can we do something different? I've been thinking about cooking." Alexander missed a note, surprised. "You cook? As well as you play Heart and Soul," she teased, but her eyes sparkled. "But Sophie always says it's the intention that counts." "In that case," he smiled, "I can't wait to prove your intentions." The song continued, evolving naturally into something more complex, more personal. Like them, Charlotte thought, from a simple 4-note melody to an intricate and unique composition. As the sun began to set, painting the room golden through the large windows, Charlotte realized that she had found something she thought she had lost forever, not just music, but the ability to dream, to take risks, to allow her heart to play its own melodies. "At 7?" Alexander asked, getting up reluctantly. "At 7, she confirmed, watching him go. Alone again, Charlotte turned her attention to her students' scores, but her thoughts kept returning to the evening to come. Like the music that now filled her life, she was learning that some of the most beautiful compositions come when we least expect them, born from silence and the courage to try a new melody. The aroma of homemade pasta filled Charlotte's small apartment when the doorbell rang at 7 o'clock. She took a deep breath, trying to calm the nerves that made her hands shake in a way they never did when she played the piano. "Is something burning?" was Alexander's first question as he entered, his teasing smile softening the concern in his voice. "The sauce is caramelizing," Charlotte replied defensively, rushing into the kitchen. The sound of Alexander laughing followed her. "Let me help," he offered, removing his jacket and rolling up the sleeves of his white shirt. Charlotte couldn't help noticing how different he seemed this way. More relaxed, more approachable. "Do you know how to cook?" she asked, watching him critically examine the pan of what was supposed to be marinara sauce. "I grew up with an Italian mother," he replied, already reaching for fresh herbs in the small vegetable garden Charlotte kept by the kitchen window. Some things are impossible not to learn. Working side by side, they managed to turn the near disaster into something not only edible, but surprisingly delicious. Charlotte's kitchen, normally a solitary space where she prepared quick meals between her long working hours, now seemed alive with laughter and conversation. "Maya reminds me of you," Alexander commented as they savored their dinner, sitting at the small counter that separated the kitchen from the living room. "The same intensity when you play, as if the rest of the world disappeared." Charlotte smiled, remembering that morning's lesson. She has something special. They all do. Really. It's amazing how music can transform a shy child into someone completely different. "How did it transform you?" Alexander asked softly. Charlotte played with her fork, considering the question. "Music was my refuge after our parents died. It was as if, through it, I could express everything I couldn't say in words. And now?" "Now," she hesitated, meeting his gaze. "Now is different. It's less about escaping and more about returning to myself, to who I was always meant to be." Alexander reached over the counter, his fingers finding hers. "And who was that person?" "I'm still finding out," she smiled. "But I think she likes teaching as much as playing. And maybe she's ready for some more changes in her life." The moment was interrupted by Charlotte's phone ringing with a message from Sophie. "She wants to know if I've kissed my boss yet," Charlotte read out loud before she could stop herself, immediately blushing. Alexander laughed, but his eyes remained serious. "And have you?" In response, Charlotte stood up, walking over to the small digital piano against the living room wall. "Do you know this one?" she asked, starting to play the first chords of La Vie en Rose. Alexander followed her, positioning himself behind her. "My mother used to play this song," he said, his voice close to her ear. "She said it was the only song that made my father dance." Charlotte felt his hands on her shoulders, gently turning her to face him. The song continued to play in her mind as he leaned in slowly. The first kiss was soft, hesitant, like the first notes of a new composition. The second was deeper, surer, like a familiar melody finding its rhythm. "Sophie's going to be impossible after this," Charlotte murmured when they broke apart, making Alexander laugh. "Maybe we should give her more to celebrate," he suggested, his fingers tracing the outline of Charlotte's face. "How about accompanying me to the Philharmonic concert next weekend? As my official date, not as my receptionist or program director." "Alexander," Charlotte began, concern appearing in her eyes. "I know what you're going to say," he interrupted her gently. "Worried about what people will think, about your professional reputation. But Charlotte, you've earned your place on your own merits. No one who saw you with those children today could doubt that." She nodded slowly, allowing herself to believe his words. "In that case, I think I need a new dress." "Actually," Alexander smiled, "I have another suggestion. The Philharmonic is looking for a guest soloist for the second part of the program." "No," Charlotte laughed, but there was less resistance in her voice than before. "Think about it," he insisted. What better way to show the world that Charlotte Hayes is back, not just as a teacher or administrator, but as the extraordinary artist you've always been. Charlotte looked at her hands that today had guided little fingers over the keys, that had burned marinara sauce, that had found their way to Alexander's heart. Hands that, perhaps, were ready for another fresh start. "I'll think about it," she promised, pulling him in for another kiss. The evening progressed with more music, more talking and more kissing. When Alexander finally left, he left behind not only the taste of red wine and unspoken promises, but also a carefully chosen score of Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto, a clear message that he wouldn't give up on the idea easily. Alone in her apartment, Charlotte allowed herself to sit at the piano once more. As her fingers danced over the keys, she realized that she was playing La Vie en Rose again. But this time the melody carried something new, not just memories, but possibilities, dreams, and the promise of a future she hardly dared to imagine. The invitation from the Seattle Philharmonic burned metaphorically on Charlotte's desk as she watched Maya practicing her scales. The girl, focused on her task, didn't notice her teacher's internal conflict. "Ms. Hayes," Maya asked, her small hands pausing on the keys, "why do some songs make us cry even when we're happy?" The question took Charlotte by surprise, making her smile. "Because music, Maya, speaks directly to our soul. It's as if each note touches a different part of our heart. Like when you play with Mr. Mitchell?" Charlotte felt her cheeks heat up. Over the last few days, rehearsals for the charity duet had become the students' favorite subject, especially after Alexander started showing up casually during lessons to practice. "By the way," Maya continued with the innocent persistence characteristic of children, "I saw you kissing in the garden yesterday." The sound of someone sniffling at the door made them both turn around. Alexander was there, looking equally amused and embarrassed. "I think that's my cue for the interval," Maya announced with a wisdom beyond her years, picking up her sheet music. Alone, Charlotte and Alexander shared a moment of complicit silence before laughing. "The children are making bets, you know," he commented, approaching the piano. "About when we're going to get married." "Alexander," Charlotte protested, but couldn't help smiling. "We've barely started dating." Technically, he sat down next to her on the bench. "We started 2 years and 4 months ago. It just took us a while to realize it." Charlotte shook her head, but her heart raced at the ease with which he talked about a future together. Her fingers found the piano keys, absent-mindedly playing the melody they had been practicing. "I got an interesting call today," Alexander commented casually, joining her in the music. "From the San Francisco Symphony Orchestra?" Charlotte's hands froze on the keys. "Oh, apparently, someone sent a video of your performance at the benefit dinner. They're interested in you as a guest soloist for next season." "Alexander," Charlotte began, but he continued, "Before you say no, think about this. San Francisco has some of the best music education programs in the country. It would be a perfect opportunity to expand our project." "Ours?" she asked softly. "Charlotte," Alexander turned to face her fully, "do you really think that after meeting you, I would let you go it alone?" The moment was interrupted by a group of students returning from break, including Maya, who smiled knowingly. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of classes, meetings, and preparations for the charity presentation. When Charlotte finally arrived home, she found an envelope waiting for her. Inside was a plane ticket to San Francisco and a handwritten note. "For when you're ready for your next adventure. Love, Sophie." Charlotte laughed, imagining the conspiracy between her sister and Alexander. Sitting down at the piano, she began to play not the Tchaikovsky concerto she had been practicing, but a composition of her own that had been taking shape in her mind over the last few weeks. Her phone vibrated with a message from Alexander. "Dinner? I have a surprise." An hour later, she found him not in a restaurant, but in the studio of the Cultural Center. The space had been transformed. Electronic candles created an intimate atmosphere, and a table was set for 2 between the pianos. "I thought we could rehearse and have dinner," he explained, pulling up his chair, "and maybe discuss your future in San Francisco." "Our future," she corrected softly, surprising them both with her certainty. The evening progressed between music and conversation, between stolen kisses and whispered plans. At one point, Charlotte found herself telling Alexander about the composition she was working on. "It's a love story," she admitted, blushing slightly, "about finding music in unexpected places. Like a receptionist finding her voice again," he teased gently. "Like a businessman discovering that some of the best symphonies start with simple notes," she retorted. Alexander pulled her close, and they danced without music, or perhaps lulled by the music that always existed between them, even when they couldn't hear it. "Do you know what else I've learned from you?" he murmured against her hair. "That sometimes we need to lose something precious in order to find something even more valuable." Charlotte thought about her interrupted career, the years away from the stage, the path that had brought her there. "It wasn't a loss," she replied. "It was a necessary interlude." As the evening drew to a close, Alexander drove her home, but before he left, he handed her a small package. "Open it when you're alone," he asked, kissing her softly. Inside the package, Charlotte found an old score of the same piece she had played at her first public performance at the age of 12. On the cover, a simple note: "For when you're ready to start again. This time, I won't just be in the audience." Sitting down at her piano, Charlotte began to play the familiar piece, letting memories and hopes blend into a new melody that spoke not just of her past or future, but of the perfect, imperfect present she had found. News of Charlotte's performance with the Seattle Philharmonic spread like wildfire through the music community. The video of her duet with Alexander at the charity event had gone viral, generating a wave of interest that went far beyond San Francisco. At her desk in the Cultural Center, the offers were piling up: Chicago, Boston, New York. "You have to see this," Sophie said over the video call, her face beaming on the laptop screen. "The comments on your performance are incredible. There's even a fan club dedicated to the musical couple of the moment." Charlotte blushed, adjusting her glasses as she read some of the comments her sister shared. "This is crazy, Sophie. 3 months ago, I was just a receptionist." "You were never just a receptionist?" Alexander's voice sounded from the doorway, making her jump. He entered the room carrying 2 coffee cups and a folded newspaper under his arm. "Sophie, is your sister still trying to convince herself that she deserves all this success?" "As always," Sophie laughed. "Maybe you can convince her to accept that invitation from New York." Charlotte cast a warning glance at her sister, but it was too late. Alexander arched an eyebrow, interested. "What invitation from New York?" "Nothing important," Charlotte tried to cover, but Sophie was already talking. "Lincoln Center wants her to do a series of special performances." "Charlotte, show him the email." Reluctantly, Charlotte opened the email on her computer. Alexander leaned over her shoulder to read it, his familiar scent distracting her momentarily. "Charlotte," he breathed, "this is incredible. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because," she hesitated, turning to face him, "because accepting would mean spending 3 months in New York. Away from the program, from the students, from you." Sophie sniffled discreetly at the screen. "I think that's my cue. Call back later." And she disconnected, leaving them alone. Alexander pulled up a chair and sat down next to Charlotte. "First, the program is more than established. Maya is proving to be an excellent teaching assistant, and Sandra can manage the administrative side. Second," he took her hands between his. "Who said you'd go alone? Alexander, you can't just drop everything for 3 months. Actually," he smiled, "I can. Mitchell Enterprises has an office in Manhattan that has needed personal supervision for months. It would be the perfect time for an extended visit." Charlotte felt her heart race at the possibilities. "But what about us? Working together? Living in the same city? That works. But traveling together? That's a big step." "Charlotte Hayes," Alexander held her face between his hands, "I'm in love with you. Not just for the music you make, but for who you are. For your dedication to your students. For the way your eyes sparkle when you talk about composition. For the way you've transformed not only your life, but mine too." Tears began to form in Charlotte's eyes. "Alexander, let me finish," he asked softly. "When I first saw you at the piano at that charity dinner, it wasn't just the music that touched me. It was seeing someone finding their true essence again. And since then, every day with you has been like discovering a new note in a melody I thought I knew by heart." A sound at the door interrupted them. Maya was there, holding her sheet music, with a group of other students behind her. "Sorry," she smiled shyly, "but we wanted to show you something before class." The children entered, positioning themselves around the piano. Maya sat down at the instrument and, to Charlotte's surprise, began to play a simplified version of the composition Charlotte had created, the one about finding music in unexpected places. "How did you?" Charlotte asked, thrilled. "Mr. Mitchell helped us," Maya explained. "We found his notes and turned it into something we could all play together." One by one, the other students joined in the melody with their instruments: violins, flutes, even a small cello. The music Charlotte had composed with her story with Alexander in mind now came to life through her students. "See?" Alexander whispered in her ear. "Some melodies are too big to be contained in one place." In that moment, watching her students play, feeling Alexander's arm around her waist, Charlotte knew her answer. Yes, she said simply. Yes to New York? Yes to everything, she smiled, turning to kiss him, eliciting giggles and oohs from the children. Later that evening, alone in her apartment, Charlotte sat down at the piano. Her fingers naturally found the keys, and she began to play a new composition, one that spoke not of loss or recovery, but of the future and possibilities. Her phone vibrated with a message from Alexander. I miss you already. P.S. I've bought the tickets to New York. First class. I don't accept returns. Charlotte laughed, continuing to play. The music flowed easily now, as if all the notes were just waiting for the right moment to be discovered. Like her and Alexander. Like her new life. The Seattle moon shone through her window, illuminating the scores scattered over the piano. Some old, some new, all part of a larger symphony that continued to unfold. And for the first time in a long time, Charlotte wasn't afraid of the next movement. Lincoln Center shone under the Manhattan lights, its imposing architecture reflecting the nervousness Charlotte felt backstage. 3 months had passed since her arrival in New York, and tonight would mark not only her last performance in the special series, but also a turning point in her life. 5 minutes, Miss Hayes, announced the stagehand, handing her a small bouquet of white lilies with a card from Alexander. To the woman who turned silence into symphony, with eternal love. Charlotte smiled, thinking about how her life had changed since that first benefit dinner in Seattle. The music education program now had branches in 3 cities, with Maya brilliantly leading the classes in Seattle under Sanders' supervision. The weekly video calls with her students were filled with stories of progress and impromptu performances. Charlotte? Sophie's voice surprised her. Her sister, now a thriving medical student, had flown in from Seattle for the final presentation. I thought you weren't coming until tomorrow. Charlotte hugged Sophie, trying not to wrinkle her performance dress. And missed the big moment? Never. Sophie smiled mysteriously. Besides, Alexander insisted that I arrive today. Before Charlotte could question the comment, the conductor appeared to lead her onto the stage. The theater was packed with a combination of critics, admirers and, to her surprise, several of her Seattle students, including Maya, who waved discreetly from the front row. The concert began with Rachmaninoff, his hands dancing over the keys with a confidence that had grown with each performance over the last few months. But it was the second part of the program that set her heart racing with the world premiere of her own composition, Unexpected Melodies. During the interval, Charlotte met Alexander in his dressing room. He looked especially dapper in his tuxedo, but there was something different in his eyes, a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that she rarely saw. Ready for the second half? He asked, absent-mindedly adjusting his bow tie. Almost, she smiled. But first, I want to know why half my students are in the audience without you having mentioned anything. Let's just say that some surprises deserve a special audience, he replied enigmatically, kissing her softly before leaving. When Charlotte returned to the stage for the second part, something had changed in the orchestra's arrangement. A second piano had been positioned next to hers, and Alexander walked towards it, to the amazement of the audience. Ladies and gentlemen, he said into the microphone, tonight is not just about music. It's about transformation, about finding harmony in the most unexpected places. Turning to Charlotte, he continued, 3 months ago, when we came to New York, you asked me if I was sure about taking this step. Today, I want to take another, much more important step. Charlotte's heart stopped when Alexander knelt down beside his piano, taking a small velvet box out of his pocket. Charlotte Hayes, you have transformed my life into a symphony that I never want to stop listening to. Every day with you is a new note in an infinite composition of love, respect, and admiration. Will you accept me as your partner in this performance for life? Tears streamed down Charlotte's face as she nodded, unable to form words. The audience erupted into applause as Alexander slid the ring onto her finger, a delicate platinum circle with tiny musical notes engraved on it. When she finally managed to pull herself together, Charlotte realized that the orchestra had started playing not her programmed composition, but a special arrangement of La Vie en Rose, the song they had shared on their first night together. Alexander sat down at the second piano, and together they transformed the piece into something new, a duet that spoke of love, loss, rediscovery, and Above all, the courage to allow your heart to play its own melody. After the performance, the Lincoln Center foyer was transformed into an impromptu engagement party. Maya gave a special performance with other students of an elaborate version of the first piece Charlotte had taught her. "I knew this would happen from day one," Sophie commented, hugging her sister. "The way he looked at you as you played. Some songs are written in the stars." Later that evening, Charlotte and Alexander walked through Central Park. The New York moon is different and yet as familiar as the Seattle one. "So," she smiled, her fingers intertwined with his, "when did you start planning all this?" "Honestly, the moment I saw you play for the first time at that benefit dinner," Alexander confessed. "But the ring, I bought it the day you agreed to come to New York. I knew I was ready for a lifetime of duets with you." "And what happens now?" Charlotte asked, stopping to look at him. "Now," he smiled, "we start our own songwriting. Seattle, New York, wherever the music takes us. The important thing is that we play together." The next day, as they were packing to return to Seattle, Charlotte found an old piece of sheet music among her things, the same one Alexander had given her months ago. On the cover, there was a new note: "For when we're ready for our next adventure, this time and all the others will be side by side." Charlotte smiled, carefully putting the sheet music away. Her life had become something that not even her wildest dreams could have predicted, a symphony of love, music, and endless possibilities. And now, with Alexander by her side, she was ready for every new movement that came along.